a wild and untamed horse was brought to the auction house. Ted immediately noticed its extraordinary qualities and couldn't help but bid 1 guinea.
1 guinea.
Unexpectedly, his archenemy also took a liking to this horse. Their eyes met, filled with hostility, and they began to bid frantically against each other. Ted's friends quickly advised him to give up, but he gritted his teeth and shouted an exorbitant price.
30 guineas!
His rival smirked, knowing that the market price of this horse was only £10. Realizing this, Ted felt deeply regretful. Ted's wife had asked him to buy a strong horse that could plow the land, but now, due to his impulsiveness, he bought a pampered steed. How would he explain this when he got home? Little did he know that the gears of fate for this horse had just started to turn. When he got home, his wife saw that not only had her husband bought a horse that couldn't plow the land, but he had also spent all their savings. She immediately erupted in anger. Unexpectedly, their son Albert also noticed the horse's uniqueness and immediately pleaded to keep and train it. His mother had no choice but to reluctantly agree. However, she stipulated that they would only give it 1 month of training. If it still couldn't plow the land by then, they would have to sell it. The next day, Albert began his journey of taming the horse. To reduce the horse's wariness, he turned his back and used food as a bridge to slowly approach it. Without the tension of direct confrontation, the horse finally lowered its guard and started eating. Albert took this opportunity to gently stroke its neck and named it Joey. In the days that followed, Joey quickly showed its exceptional qualities. It learned all of Albert's commands in one go and could always find Albert accurately whenever he whistled. However, it didn't last long, and soon it was rent collection season. But Ted simply couldn't come up with the 30 guineas. He could only promise the landlord that he would cultivate a piece of wasteland and grow carrots, and that he would pay back the rent with interest when the harvest came. In the end, the landlord agreed to extend the deadline to October. If they couldn't repay the rent by then, they would be evicted from the farm. After the landlord left, a drunk Ted stormed into the storeroom and picked up the plow harness, intending to put it on Joey's head. Joey resisted violently, kicking Ted to the ground. In a fit of anger, Ted grabbed his shotgun and was about to shoot Joey. Luckily, at the critical moment, Albert stepped in front of Joey. He firmly told his father that he would definitely teach Joey to plow. With his wife's soothing words, Ted finally put down the shotgun. The next day, Albert first put the harness on himself, then cautiously approached Joey. This time, Joey did not resist, and Albert successfully put the harness on it. Once everything was ready, Albert began to plow the wasteland. However, Joey didn't know how to plow and just stood there motionless. The landlord, wanting to see Ted humiliated, called the villagers from miles around to watch. Seeing Joey standing still, Albert had no choice but to harden his heart and whip it. Startled and in pain, Joey charged forward, dragging Albert several meters along the ground. The landlord began to laugh mercilessly and continued to loudly mock Albert, adding fuel to the fire. As more and more neighbors gathered to watch, Albert's mother felt deeply ashamed and hid in the house, knitting to avoid the humiliation. But Albert did not give up. He lifted the plow and patiently directed Joey to move forward again. The wasteland was full of stones, and the plow couldn't break the soil. After several hours of struggle, Joey finally learned to plow, but the land was as hard as rock, and the plow couldn't penetrate the soil. All their efforts seemed to be in vain. Soon, a sudden downpour scattered the crowd but brought new hope to Albert. The rain softened the soil, creating a perfect opportunity for plowing. Albert quickly encouraged Joey, perhaps sensing his owner's expectation and the burden they carried. Joey, at Albert's command, plowed through the mud like a battleship cutting through waves, turning over layers of earth and reigniting the family's hope. At that moment, a large stone blocked their path. Albert hurriedly called for Joey to stop, but Joey, undeterred, split the stone in two with sheer force. Hearing the commotion, the neighbors returned to witness this miraculous horse. Seeing the land plowed inch by his son, Ted's face was filled with pride and relief. Joey successfully turned the wasteland into arable land, restoring hope to Ted's family. After the rain cleared, the wasteland was finally transformed into fertile land. Exhausted, Albert collapsed to the ground, his shoulders covered in bloodstains from the harness. His mother used strong alcohol to clean his wounds, but Albert recoiled at the smell of alcohol. In his memories, his father was either drunk or on his way to buy more alcohol, leading their family to its current plight. Hearing this, his mother said nothing but retrieved some medals from a pile of long-forgotten belongings. It turned out that his father had once been a decorated cavalryman, but he took no pride in it. After the war, he had immediately discarded the medals. This revealed Ted's inner kindness and conflict. He used drinking to escape from the killing he had once done. No wonder Ted had insisted on buying Joey, who was destined to become a warhorse. At that moment, Albert truly understood his father. He silently vowed to make his father proud and aspired to become a cavalryman like him. So, he trained with Joey on the hillside every day. However, good times did not last. A fierce storm suddenly hit, flooding the fields and ruining the soon-to-be-harvested carrots. shattering the family's last hope. Coincidentally, war broke out, and Britain officially declared war on Germany. The army urgently needed war horses, and Ted, in his son's absence, had no choice but to sell Joey to Captain Nichols. By the time Albert arrived, the transaction was already complete. Faced with an unchangeable reality, Albert could only request to enlist with Joey, but because he didn't meet the age requirement, he was rejected by the officer. Fortunately, Nichols was also a horse lover. He took off his military cap and sincerely promised Albert, "I will take good care of him, as much as you would. I will respect him and care for him like you do. If possible, I will bring him back after the war." Despite his immense reluctance, Albert had no choice but to agree. As the army departed, Albert tied his father's military flag to Joey and promised, "No matter where you are, I will find you." This marked the beginning of Joey's legendary life. On the first day at the military camp, Joey was provoked by a black horse. Its owner mocked Joey as nothing more than a showpiece, saying he was still inferior to his own. Blackthorn, Nichols, though feeling indignant, could only remain silent as a subordinate. However, during the sprint drill on the second day, Nichols rode Joey to compete against the officers. Blackthorn. At the start of the race, Blackthorn quickly dashed out of the starting line, leading by a wide margin. Joey followed closely behind, leaving all the other horses far behind. In the end, Joey won by a horse length, earning the officers' genuine admiration. As the two men chatted, Joey and Blackthorn started to bond, forming a deep friendship. The next day, Nichols drew a portrait of Joey's majestic figure and prepared to write a letter to Albert, eager to tell him how outstanding Joey was performing in the camp. However, this tranquility was soon shattered. In 1914, the cavalry regiment arrived in France and received orders to launch a surprise attack on a German unit that was 3 times their size. Nichols couldn't guarantee Joey's survival, so he tied Albert's military flag onto Joey. Then, under the cover of the bushes, the cavalry charged at the enemy without hesitation. It was a vast plain. The German soldiers, just getting up and washing, were caught off guard as the British cavalry charged in, trampling many under their iron hooves. They drove the Germans into the woods, thinking it would be a one-sided massacre. Unexpectedly, the enemy had already set up a trap. With machine gunners in place, dozens of machine guns spewed fire simultaneously, bullets slicing through the air like the scythe of death, weaving a curtain of death. Under this merciless gunfire, the cavalry was like a swarm of ants swept away by a storm, instantly turning to dust. The surviving officers had no choice but to surrender. Fortunately, Joey survived the chaos. Seeing this, Blackthorn broke free from the soldiers and ran to Joey, like an old friend reunited. However, since the German troops were fully mechanized, the officer decided to execute all the horses and turn them into rations. A soldier named Gunther, feeling compassionate, suggested to the officer that they could use the horses to transport supplies and wounded soldiers. This suggestion spared the horses, but Blackthorn refused to wear the farming harness. If this continued, the officer would surely execute it. Just when Gunther was at his wit's end, Joey came over and demonstrated, as if saying to Blackthorn, "Look, it's not dangerous at all." With this encouragement, Blackthorn cooperated and put on the harness. Meanwhile, far away in England, Albert received a package containing Joey's portrait and the news of Nichols' death on the battlefield. The sudden turn of events left him stunned. This meant Joey's fate was now uncertain, but their bond had not ended. On the other side, because Gunther knew how to care for horses, the officer kept him in logistics while his younger brother was ordered to the front lines, where death was almost certain. Even though the officer knew he was only 14 years old, this highlighted the reason why people hate war. In the face of the national machine, individual lives are so insignificant. Gunther could only give the flag around Joey's neck to his brother, hoping it would bring him luck. But Gunther soon regretted it because he had promised their mother to take care of his brother. So, the next day, during the march, he rode Joey and Blackthorn into the ranks, forcibly pulling his brother onto the horse. The two brothers galloped away until nightfall, finally finding refuge on a farm. They fantasized about returning home after the war, unaware that desertion was a grave offense. That night, they were captured by the German soldiers who had come after them. With a gunshot, the two brothers were executed as deserters. In the end, Gunther failed to fulfill his promise to his mother, but the two horses were lucky enough to survive. The next morning, a little girl found the two fine horses in the windmill house. From that day on, she became their new owner. She fed them carefully every day and sometimes taught Joey to jump over hurdles. However, her grandfather forbade her from riding the horses, citing her short stature. The girl had to bring a small ladder to prove herself. At this moment, her grandfather suddenly showed a look of terror and quickly told his granddaughter to hide the two horses. A German troop was approaching, plundering everything, even the freshly made jam. The officer arrogantly stated that they would return in a few months. After the soldiers left, the girl felt deeply disappointed in her grandfather's cowardice. Her parents had been killed by the Germans, and today, Faced with the Germans again, her grandfather did nothing. She thought her grandfather was a coward, but he had to explain to her. The girl, upon understanding, couldn't help but shed tears. The reason her grandfather lived in fear was to protect her with his aged wings. What could be braver than that? 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. On the girl's birthday, her grandfather gave her a saddle. The girl finally got to ride the horse as she had wished. She excitedly galloped over the hills, and as she disappeared from sight, her grandfather anxiously called for her to come back, but there was no response for a long time. At this moment, Blackthorn suddenly became restless. Her grandfather rushed over to check and found that the girl had been surrounded by German soldiers. Despite their desperate pleas, the 2 horses were forcibly taken away to serve the army. However, this time they weren't so lucky. They were assigned to pull heavy artillery. Halfway through, a horse collapsed from exhaustion, and the officer shot it dead. He then called for the tall Blackthorn to take its place. The attending soldier quickly told the officer, "This is a good horse, but its leg is already injured. If it pulls the heavy artillery, it will surely die." But the officer replied, "You should not have sympathy for something destined to be lost. Even human life is cheap on the battlefield, let alone a mere animal." At that moment, Joey suddenly broke free and ran to the front. Seeing his friends safely leave, Joey looked back with red eyes, as if saying goodbye to his only friend. But fate gave him no respite. The artillery was too heavy. Joey trembled and struggled, but finally managed to pull the cannon to the top of the hill. The waiting soldiers quickly loaded the shells, and at the officer's command, numerous shells rained down on the British positions. Albert, who had just enlisted, was among them. The landlord's son was also there. After the bombardment, the infantry battle began. With the sound of the charge, the soldiers rushed towards the enemy lines under a hail of bullets. Life became exceedingly fragile at that moment, with countless soldiers falling with every step forward. The landlord's son was unfortunately hit in the leg. Seeing this, Albert quickly helped him into a shell hole to take cover. Although they were sworn enemies, at this moment, they were brothers in life and death. The battle continued. Seeing that the enemy position was still not taken, Albert threw a grenade, creating a breach. When they rushed into the trench, they found it already abandoned by the enemy. Strangely, all the fallen enemies were wearing gas masks. Before they could react, an old soldier urgently shouted, "Gas, gas!" and they were quickly engulfed by the pervasive white smoke. On the other side, the German troops were orderly retreating. By this time, Blackthorn's leg was infected and festering, and it was walking weakly. The soldier quickly brought him aside to rest, but he still collapsed. Finally, amid Joey's mournful cries, Blackthorn slowly closed his eyes, marking the end of their friendship. At that moment, British tanks roared in. Several comrades forcibly dragged the soldier away, and soon after, the tank ruthlessly rolled over Blackthorn's body. Joey had no choice but to flee in panic. Yet, despite the vastness of the world, there was no place for it. Ultimately, he was trapped in a barbed wire enclosed abyss. The sound of tank treads, like the death knell, crept closer and closer. At this life and death moment, Joey let out a piercing neigh and then leapt with all his might, vaulting over the tank. In panic, Joey lost all his previous composure and courage, running wildly and weaving through different battlefields. No matter where it ran, he couldn't escape the desolation of the battlefield or the fate manipulated by humans. Layers of barbed wire wrapped around it like the shackles of fate. In his desperate struggle, it exhausted his last bit of strength and finally fell into a deep sleep with a final, despairing cry. Next morning, the British soldiers were the first to discover Joey lying on the ground. One soldier tried to call it over, and then his comrades followed suit, calling out to Joey. Unexpectedly, the German soldiers on the other side also began to whistle and call for Joey. Despite the harshness of war, the light of humanity could still shine through the darkness, touching the hearts of those on both sides. They used melodious whistles and heartfelt calls, trying to awaken the spirit of the trapped warhorse. It was a tribute to the reverence for life. At this moment, a British soldier couldn't hold back any longer. He raised a white flag and slowly walked out. Seeing this, the German soldiers thought it was a trap and loaded their guns. Firing a shot next to him, the soldier quickly shouted an explanation and, despite his officer's warning, continued walking forward. However, in his haste, he forgot to bring the pliers. Just as he was regretting this, he turned and saw a German soldier behind him. He handed over the pliers and was about to get to work when the German soldier told him to wait, explaining that cutting the wire recklessly could cause it to rebound, inflicting further harm. The two began to analyze the best way to cut the wire. They eventually agreed that cutting from both sides simultaneously would prevent harming the horse's eyes. Unfortunately, they only had one pair of pliers, so the German soldier called out behind him,
"We need more wire cutters!"
Who would have thought that such a humorous and harmonious scene would take place on the battlefield? The two men couldn't help but chat and laugh. even agreeing to invite each other over after the war ended. But the moment Joey was freed and stood up, the two turned hostile immediately, because Joey was caught in the middle of the two armies' territories. Both claimed it as their own, but neither could provide proof. The German soldier suggested resolving it through force, but this could potentially reignite the conflict. They finally agreed to settle it with a coin toss. The coin landed heads up, giving the British soldier ownership of Joey. Now, they had to quickly return to their respective sides, because the war will soon begin again. They shook hands amicably and bid farewell. Meanwhile, Albert had miraculously survived the gas attack, but his eyes were temporarily blinded. At this moment, Joey, having returned, happened to pass by him. Everyone was talking about the warhorse that had miraculously survived no man's land, and Albert heard about it from his comrades. However, when the doctor examined Joey's wounds, he suggested putting him down. As the multiple infected wounds made survival unlikely, it would be more merciful to end its suffering. The soldiers were reluctant, and the officer silently loaded his gun. But just as he aimed at Joey, a familiar whistle suddenly sounded. Everyone curiously looked behind but saw no one whistling. The officer repositioned Joey's head and raised his gun again. This time, the whistle sounded once more. Joey was now certain that it was Albert whistling. A path opened up through the crowd, and all eyes turned to the fumbling Albert. A soldier reminded him to whistle again. Despite the years that had passed, Joey had never forgotten this sound. After countless dark nights, they were finally reunited, and Albert fulfilled his promise made at their parting. At this moment, the army doctor came over. He believed that Joey was just an ordinary stray horse, and its response to the whistle was merely a coincidence. Although Albert couldn't see, he immediately described Joey's features. The doctor checked Joey's hooves but found they didn't match Albert's description. At this point, the soldier who had rescued Joey became anxious. He explained that the hooves were dirty and fetched a bucket of clean water. As the mud was washed away, 4 white hooves emerged. The doctor, somewhat incredulous, pulled out a cloth from his pocket and wiped Joey's forehead. A diamond-shaped mark appeared, astonishing everyone present. They were deeply moved by the horse's legendary journey. The doctor also promised to take care of Joey with the same effort as they did with the soldiers. Only then did Albert feel at ease. 3 months later, the war finally ended. By this time, Albert's eyesight had fully recovered. He thought he could take Joey home, but the general informed him that only officers could keep their horses. All other horses were to be auctioned off. Even the officer's plea on his behalf was to no avail. Faced with this harsh reality, Albert had no choice but to lead Joey out of the stable. To his surprise, the area was filled with people. His comrades had already heard Joey's story and pooled together 29 guineas for him. Confident, Albert went to the auction, but a French landowner kept raising the bid. Determined to acquire all the good horses, the officer started bidding on Albert's behalf, and they fiercely competed, quickly reaching the 30 guineas that Albert's father had originally paid for Joey. But now Albert was short on money. At this moment, a startling bid silenced the crowd.
100 pounds.
Ultimately, an old man won Joey with an astonishing bid of 100 guineas. This outcome left Albert at a loss. He pleaded with the old man to sell Joey to him, offering to pay double in installments. The old man, however, said, "When I heard this horse's legendary story, I walked for 3 days and nights to get here. The war has taken everything from everyone, but this horse was my granddaughter's favorite, and it's the only gift I can bring to her." The old man's granddaughter had passed away a few months earlier due to illness. The horse was his only remaining connection to her, and hearing this, Albert couldn't argue any further. As the old man prepared to leave, Joey suddenly broke free from his reins and joyfully ran towards Albert, as if saying a final goodbye. This touching scene moved the old man deeply. Even though Albert's heart was full of reluctance, he softly reassured Joey, "Don't worry, we've survived the hardest times. We are lucky. From the day I met you, I've always been lucky." Holding back tears, Albert sent Joey back. For him, Joey's survival was already a gift from above. Watching Albert's lonely figure walking away, the old man handed him the flag. Afterwards, the old man departed gracefully. Albert couldn't help but ask the girl's name.
Her name is Emily.
Sometimes, letting go doesn't mean losing. It's a deeper form of possession and a respect for life and love. As the sunset bathed the sky in golden light, the man and horse finally set off on their journey home. Their steps were light, as if they had never experienced the war. Joey's return was like a fairy tale filled with hope and redemption, symbolizing people's longing for a better future. However, what Joey witnessed along the way was the loss of innocent lives, the destruction of countless homes, and the tragedies of families torn apart. This was the true face of war. It is a heavy chapter in history, written with blood and tears. We are grateful to the martyrs who built a wall of peace at the cost of their lives, and thankful that we live in a strong country that spares us the pain of losing everything. May peace prevail forever. I am a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel. See you next time.